Yeah, well, I wanted to talk about the evidence that relates our salt intake to blood pressure, and it's not, when you think about it, not very obvious. Why should this white crystal that we add to food, and in particular is put in very large amounts in by the food industry and catering industry and restaurants and so on, why should it put up our blood pressure, and what's the evidence? Because some people even now are questioning what that evidence is. And the reason why we're convinced that salt and blood pressure are related goes back to studies in the early 19th century. French nephrologists were first aware of the important role of salt in putting up blood pressure. But more recently, we've had very carefully controlled studies looking at what we call the epidemiology, that is, looking at different places in the world that have different salt intakes and look at how many of them have high blood pressure. And those studies quite clearly showed, in more than 50 studies, that in communities that didn't eat salt, there was no rise in blood pressure with age, no high blood pressure, whereas in communities that did, there was a rise in blood pressure with age and development of high blood pressure. But these studies were not uniformly done, had different things, so they then did a big international study, the so-called InterSalt study, looking at different communities with the same methodology, and showed exactly the same, that in other words, those countries that ate salt had developed high blood pressure, those that didn't develop high blood pressure, and the rate of rise in blood pressure with age was dependent on salt intake. We therefore also have migration studies where people have migrated from a low salt to a high salt environment, particularly studies in Kenya where people have gone from a rural to an urban environment. They've documented the rise in salt intake and the rise in blood pressure. We also have community studies where communities have been studied where reduced salt intake, particularly one in Portugal, which has the highest salt intake in the world and the highest stroke rate. They took two similar villages. One was given products, Portuguese processed food products with half the amount of salt and given instructions how to eat much less salt. The other village had the same measurements but no special foods and no special instructions about salt. And they were very successful in reducing salt by half in the village that had the salt reduction. And this, over the course of the next few years, did cause a big difference in blood pressure between the two villages, clearly showing that if a community does reduce salt by half, there are big differences in blood pressure to the control village. We also have a huge amount of animal evidence that all animals, where they develop high blood pressure, they have to eat a high salt intake. They will not develop blood pressure on their normal salt intake. And in particular chimpanzees, that are our nearest related species, that given the same amount of salt that we're given, i.e. 10 to 15 grams, within 6 months they have a big rise in blood pressure similar to humans. It's very difficult to argue why should chimpanzees get this rise in blood pressure and humans don't. We also have genetic studies which clearly show that in single gene mutations, that's where there's a small change in the gene that causes a problem with the kidney's ability to hold on to salt, because all the salt comes out in the urine and you have exquisite mechanisms controlling that. Where you hold on to it too much and you can't get rid of it, you develop high blood pressure. And where you can't hold on and too much comes out in the urine, then you get low blood pressure. And that's pretty convincing just on its own. Then we have all the treatment trials where you take people in randomized controlled trials and either half of them have instructions how to reduce salt, half don't, or you cross them over on a low and normal salt intake. And that clearly shows big falls in blood pressure, both in people with high blood pressure and normal blood pressure. So we know that if people reduce salt, they will get a fall in blood pressure. We then have cohort studies, which have been a matter of controversy, because when you measure salt intake and then follow them up, you might expect that more of them on the higher salt group would develop strokes and heart attacks. Now, some of those studies show that, other studies don't. But the problem, the big problem with these studies is measuring salt intake in individuals. Because when you think about it, your salt intake varies from day to day. And most of the studies that have not shown a relationship are using spot urines, which is a useless way of measuring individual salt intake. Even if we take 24-hour urine, that's all the salt you pass in 24 hours, which accurately reflects what you ate the day before. It all depends what you ate the day before. You might have had very salty pizza, then you'll have very high salt in the urine the next day. As if you had cooked at home and had a meal with less salt, there'll be less salt in the urine. So it's varying from day to day, and taking one urine doesn't reflect your average salt intake. There are big problems with those studies, and some of them show effects, some don't. But we also have outcome trials where longer-term studies of salt reduction have been done, which show for a 2-gram reduction, i.e. a very small reduction. Remember, we eat about 10 grams, and we want to get it down by half to 5. So 2-gram reduction caused a 1/3 reduction in cardiovascular events. Pretty impressive. And then, of course, we have countries that now have reduced salt. Japan in the early 1960s reduced salt, government campaign. Big reductions in salt intake in the northern islands of Japan, big reductions in blood pressure and stroke rates. Similarly in Finland, where they've been reducing salt for over 30 years, big fall in salt intake from 14 grams to 9 grams, big falls in blood pressure and stroke rates. And now we have the UK, which in the last 5 years has reduced salt intake by 1.5 grams by getting the food industry to put less salt into foods. That has caused a fall in population blood pressure and will have caused over 9,000 deaths a year from strokes and heart attacks to be saved. In other words, those people are no longer dying because of the reduction in salt intake. So you can see that actually when you look at the totality of evidence about salt, it is overwhelming. And that's what's convinced us, convinced all other experts, and convinced nearly every Ministry of Health, the World Health Organization, the Institute of Medicine, and all sorts of other medical bodies to clearly say that salt reduction is one of the most effective public health policies there is, along with tobacco reduction. And indeed, salt reduction is very cheap to do. It's by far the most cost-effective public health measure we know to tackle unnecessary deaths from strokes, heart attacks, and heart failure. Thank you.